Very warm welcome to you all on our fifth and final bite-sized webinar series covering IR35. For those of you who missed the first four seminars, we covered a number of topics. Firstly, who is responsible in your organisation. Secondly, looking at assessing the level of risk across your organisation. Thirdly, how to make a determination. And our prior webinar covered retaining access to talent of skilled contractors. So today we have 30 minutes today to talk over the solutions phase. So the first 20 minutes, Mike and I will be covering that and looking at how you should be considering the options available to you and what are they. And then we'll spend the final 10 minutes answering any questions you have. So please may I ask, as we go through, if you have any questions, just jump onto the Q&A box and ask as we go through. So some quick introductions. I'm Jeff Fawcett, Head of Corporate Engagement for Hayes in UK and Ireland. Most of my work involves designing, providing outsourcing recruitment solutions across both permanent and non-permanent workforces. I think it's fair to say, due to the significance of the IR35 potential impact into the non-perm workforce, I spend perhaps 50% of my time consulting with current and potential customers around their potential risks, opportunities and solutions. I'd like to introduce Mike McNally. Mike's a Solutions Director for Hayes. He's been with us for 20 years, and most of his work involves designing and deploying non-permanent workforce solutions for clients across the UK. So just in terms of the agenda for today, I'll start with a quick IR35 recap for those of you who've missed it, and then Mike will move into looking at cost-effective solutions to manage risk, ensure compliance, and ensure you're accessing the skilled contractors you need. And then we'll spend the final 10 minutes covering any Q&A you may have. So, to start with an IR35 recap. IR35 isn't new, is the first thing to point out. It's been with us for nearly 20 years. And realistically, what it was set up for was legislation that was set up to tackle perceived tax avoidance via personal services companies to mask what is arguably the employee-employer relationship. And this was launched, actually came live in 2000. The onus at that point really, and has been for the last 17 years, was the onus was actually with the individual, i.e. the contractor, to determine whether he or she falls inside or outside of scope. And given the number of, or the hundreds of thousands of people who operated like this, it was very difficult for the HMRC to police and spend the resource actually going after these individuals. And when they actually did, many of these challenges were proved unsuccessful. So there's a series of legislative changes during that time, but the significant change really occurred under this off-payroll working legislation, which was introduced in April 2017, which impacted the public sector and is still obviously in place. And this fundamentally moved the responsibility from the individual broadly to the organisation and the engager. And really, when they launched this, the plan was introduced, they made a note at this time that there was a plan to introduce the rules into the private sector shortly after 2017. Now, this hasn't occurred as yet, but this is broadly what we're discussing. What we can note and inform you of is that we have seen the HMRC starting to audit public sector organisations to give a view of to test the accuracy of the determinations they've made subsequently. And where we're up to at the moment, the consultation into the private sector concluded about a month ago, actually August the 10th, and then we're awaiting decisions or an indication of the decision, which is likely to come in in November. In the autumn statement. So the question is, at this point, is this 2019, April 2019 landing, or is it April 2020? Will it look the same? And I think probably a note on that would be that it's likely to look very similar, and our best advice is for organisations to prepare as if it is going to be April 2019 and see it as having a benefit and having an extra year if it is in fact April 2020. But we don't have any conclusive timelines on this at this point. So Mike, if I can hand across to you.
Thanks, Jeff. So my day job, I guess, effectively is client solution design, and over the last 18 months I've worked with a number of our existing customers to incorporate, in the public sector, to incorporate changes around how they deliver contingent workforce programs through the lens of IR35. And increasingly we're talking now to private sector customers about what a solution will or might need to look like as and when that legislation changes. So I just wanted to share some of my experience around delivering that, and what I guess we're advising customers need to consider as part of that process. Now, in essence, it's largely determined by the size and scope of your organisation, and in terms of your size of your contingent workforce. So there's 3 stages for me. We need to identify, do some analysis, and then understand what the most appropriate solution is. So what does that mean? So effectively, identify. First stage, I think we need to make sure that you currently have an understanding of what non-permanent resource you have in your organisations. And in my experience, there's a whole range of different customer knowledge around this, and that ranges from organisations where they have very limited visibility of this at the minute and they need to start from scratch, through to customers who may have some form of tracking system, and also then into customers who may already have a programme through which they've got very clear visibility of that. But it's a key work stream, I think, to start this off, is to understand what current non-permanent resource you have in your organisation at the moment. And that might be done either through something as simple as creating a spreadsheet to track that, or it can be as complex as having to track through all of your financial back office systems to understand where that information may come from. The second piece then after that is the analysis, and typically there's a number of different questions I think that we'd suggest you need to ask as part of this piece of work. And this is primarily around how is the resource currently engaged, on what contractual terms are they engaged, by whom, how are they being paid, and for how long have they been in your organisation, because all of these factors are potentially critical when looking at a determination further down the line. So you may have workers engaged directly on your payroll who are non-permanent. You may well be using recruitment agencies for supply of contingent workforce, or equally consultants. So there are a number of different sources to check around this, and also to understand what your approvals process looks like in terms of how you hire or bring somebody into the business. Is there a decision around how that resource will come into the business? The third part then is to arrive at your solution is based on the profile of your non-permanent workforce. Are you able then to do a risk assessment and to understand what your options are? So, for example, if the majority of your workforce is working on a PAYE basis, then it's unlikely that they are going to be in scope, and therefore you're going to have probably a smaller piece of work to understand around what a solution might look like. Equally, if you've got 95% of your workforce who are working under a public services company at the moment on a contractor basis, then the chances are that you're going to have to do a significant piece of work to understand what the risk might look like with those individuals. So that primarily is the process that we've gone through with a number of customers at the minute. The available options then, I think, in terms of a solution are dependent on those outcomes. So what are you responsible for then to arrive at that? You need to be able to, as I said, to run through the data gathering process. You're going to need to do some engagement with your suppliers, so whether they're direct, whether it's consultant or through agencies, to understand the makeup of that workforce, and to do the analysis that we touched on earlier around the risk assessment. I think there's also a consideration around whether or not you will need some form of technology to support any solution that you decide to deploy, and this will be driven quite often by the number of workers that you have and the number of workers who potentially are in scope. And there are other considerations that then come into play around the cultural change that needs to take place in the workforce around that hiring process, and also then any associated training that hiring managers may need to undertake to be able to create an appropriate job specification and to identify the correct characteristics of that role to be able to allow the right resource to be engaged for that. There is also then a continuous review that needs to take place as part of that solution. So this isn't just taking it at a particular point in time, it's how you continually then review how your external contingent workforce is engaged. Now, in principle, there's probably two key solutions that we've identified that customers have decided to take as part of that. I think if you have a small number of contingent workers, this is potentially something that you can manage yourself, and the level of work that you'll need to be able to do to understand the risk can potentially be done by either an individual or a small group of people to manage that risk on your behalf. I think once you're into a scenario where you've got a population probably of 50+ contractors working in your organisation, then there are wider solutions that you probably need to consider. And this has broadly been focused into two areas: customers who've decided to develop an in-house capability to manage this, and those who have decided to outsource the management of that process elsewhere. What does that mean? So, practical terms, in-house, you carry out your own risk assessment to understand the profile of your workforce, what it looks like today and what it is likely to look like moving forward. There's creation of the internal comms and the message that need to go around how potentially in the future you'll need to engage those workers. We've seen customers then look to design their own process on the back of that for hiring, changing that internal process, the approvals process, and how you actually engage a contingent resource to be more compliant. Technology, as I said earlier, there's a question around the need for some technology to deliver this. Broadly, the greater the volumes, the more the technology plays a role in terms of managing this, whether you've got something you can use already or whether you might consider something such as a third-party piece of vendor management software to deliver this. I think there's some considerations in there around who implements that for you, how it's deployed, whether there's any cost associated to it that probably help to drive that decision. And then there's the actual testing of contractors to make sure that the person that you typically then will engage to do a particular assignment is likely to be compliant. And there are a couple of tools that we've touched on in some of the earlier webinars around this, the CES tool, CEST, the HMRC tool, and also specialist third parties who have their own tools to deliver this. So we've seen a number of customers who've considered, and some have gone down the in-house route, and there's also the opportunity then to look to outsource some of this. And again, typically similar work streams, but what would you get by outsourcing that? Well, typically you could expect to engage with somebody who could potentially deliver that discovery phase and provide the analysis for you, provide a report to deliver what your potential exposure to this would be. There are a number of different organisations who deliver the third-party worker test. I know that we've partnered with one in particular where we've delivered some of the outsourced solutions. So if you look at outsourcing as an option, I think it's important to understand what partner you may well have in terms of providing that service for you. There's the hiring manager, trainer and communications that needs to go out into the business, so you could potentially expect somebody to deliver that for you, a set of communications around the legislatory change and also the impact it has and the requirement for hiring managers in terms of future assignments. The configuration and deployment of any technology solution and potentially the absorbing of any cost in terms of delivery for that. And there are also a number of additional benefits that you might realise as part of that, in terms of broadly delivering better value for the management of a contingent workforce piece. So those additional considerations, and just touch on a couple of those at the minute. Whilst this is potentially seen as a painful piece of legislation, I think, by some customers, it's fair to say, you could also look at this through a different lens, and look at it as an opportunity to deliver more value from your existing workforce. And there's a number of different areas that we've seen customers benefit from as part of that. So the cost element, we just look at some of the pieces of the jigsaw there. What are your current supplier margins, and what are your current pay rates at the minute? Is this an opportunity to do benchmarking exercise and to bring some of those in line? How about the control, the who, what, when and where questions that we touched on earlier? Who produces management information as part of the programme? How do you make decisions around who to hire and when to hire, how long to keep them in the business, and whether you consider internal resource or permanent hire? Compliance and legislation, there's clearly the IR35 legislation, but as many of you will be aware, there's a number of different areas such as holiday pay, AWR, pension, apprenticeship levy that have been introduced in recent years. So understanding how compliant your workforce is in terms of applying legislation and any statutory cost is quite critical. The speed to hire, could an improved process allow you to access talent more quickly and more efficiently? And there's also the knock-on effect then about quality. How do you currently measure the quality of the workers that are in your business at the moment? Do you have a means by which you can do that, or do you need some data to support that? And this potentially could give you an opportunity to deliver that. And finally, a way to communicate to your business and also to your suppliers about how you engage workers, and also to communicate to your potential candidates and give them an improved candidate journey and experience as part of that, are all potential benefits that you could expect to see as part of this exercise. So finally then, before we jump into any Q&A, question, I guess, what are other customers doing? So clearly our evidence points at the moment in terms of existing solutions sit within the public sector, and in terms of what customers have done, and we've increasingly now started to see clients taking preemptive action around what they will do to their programme in lieu of this legislation being introduced. I think where you've got a smaller number of contingent workers in your programme, making sure that you work with organisations who are able to supply your contingent workforce in a compliant manner. So partnering with either consultancy or specialist recruitment businesses who understand the questions that your hiring manager needs to have asked, and also the test that their contractor may have needed to ask, if that's the type of individual who will be assigned to a contract, and some form of audit trail and track record if you are contacted by HMRC over any of those particular assignments. At the other end of the spectrum, then clearly there's an outsourcing option, and we've seen this drive demand, I guess, for a number of programmes in managed service and MSP, where customers then have taken the opportunity that we touched on earlier to, I guess, get their house in order and to look at a programme more widely and use this as an opportunity to be able to deliver some additional benefit to a programme. And typically the benefits that you get around that are visibility. So if HMRC come knocking on your door, you can very quickly say, this is who we've got engaged, this is how they're engaged, these are the workers that they currently have in process at the moment. And you will also be able then to have either a file or a track record that supports that. Makes you less likely to be audited in the first place, and also means that the risk of having somebody assigned on a contract that shouldn't be becomes increasingly less. So in summary, you have better control, hopefully a reduction of cost, and you'll be complying with rules both current and future.
Thanks, Mike. I think there's some great points in there, and I think underlyingly it feels that organisations, as you've said, some of them are approaching it from a risk position and almost a negative. This is a difficult piece of work to do, and I think we are seeing other organisations seeing it from well, this might be an opportunity, as a number of clients have said to us, just to get the house in order and really get and deal with what's often a bit of a challenge around looking at their non-perm workforce. So thank you for that. I'd like to just ask if there's any questions, to please put them through on the Q&A box there. So I've got a first one here which says, who needs to be involved in creating a solution? Mike, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So typically you've got multiple stakeholders who are involved in that process at the minute. Tax and Treasury, clearly for obvious reasons, have got a significant stake in this, and we've seen them heavily engaged in pulling this type of program together. There's also been typically a senior stakeholder from HR involved, again for obvious reasons. Depending on the type of solution, there's procurement involvement and angle in this as well. But it's also very critical to have some of your key operations people, hiring managers and stakeholders involved as part of this. I think there's a responsibility in terms of how an assignment is raised going forward, and an understanding about what level of information needs to be included as part of that. So I think it's a joined-up effort, and it's typically been led from either an HR or procurement perspective with a tax and treasury lens over the top of it.
The next one I've got, a number actually, is are fixed-term contract workers in scope of IR35? I think the way I'd read this one, if I've got it right, is that they're on the organisation's payroll, so therefore they're in a standard employee-employer PAYE relationship. So the answer to that would be no. Next question. I'm going to ask you this one, Mike. How much does an MSP cost?
How much does an MSP cost? How long is a piece of string? So I guess in terms of the cost around a managed service program varies depending on the type of solution that you adopt. Typically, you would expect that it is self-funded or vendor-funded. So from a customer perspective, if you align it to your objectives in terms of delivering some of the outputs that we covered earlier, you should be able to work with the provider who is able to fund that through the supply chain to be able to deliver the program. So Depends, I guess, on the size of your program, but typically it should be cost neutral at best from a customer perspective.
Someone else has asked the question, how much does an MSP save?
How much does an MSP save? Okay, well, again, depends on the size of your current spend in organisation. We would expect that a customer moving from a process where they currently don't have a programme in place to a managed service, you would expect to deliver cost savings on your total spend of probably somewhere in the region of 10% in a 3-year contract. So there's an element again there in terms of the type of program you have, neutral vendor, master vendor, and some of the versions that sit in between that. But broadly speaking, the delivery cost saving piece is in the region of 10%.
I've got another one here. I think it's probably a broader question, but we'll take that. Have the government considered the knock-on effect of coming down hard on IR35? That's a really, really good question. I think, in my experience, no. I think the HMRC are clearly seeing it from a revenue collection perspective, and there's clearly a broader conversation which is saying, well, given the challenges we have around Brexit, economic conditions, have you got a number of senior contractors who frankly could either go on the beach for a while, move overseas, move to different locations where their skill set are required. I think there's an impact which we saw in public sector around projects not actually being delivered because of the scarcity of quality resource. So I'm not clear on that. It's clearly a broader question, but it's a very good one. But ultimately, I understand the revenue see it as a clear opportunity to bring funds through the door, as you'd understand their position to be.
We've got about a couple of minutes left, and there's some really great questions there. If we cannot get to all of them, I will look to respond to them separately outside of the call. But I'm just going to try and pick up a couple of them that have come in there. So one of them is around, if we get it wrong, what's the punishment? So the tax liability and the contributions that should be paid if you make an incorrect assessment are effectively the punishment. Clearly there's a reputational challenge around this as well for organisations who might well end up, particularly those who have a very public-facing perception around tax avoidance. So that's broadly been a driver for a number of customers, particularly those in the public sector who've engaged this at the moment.
I've got a question here. Who has ultimate liability for breach of HMRC IR35 worker, recruiter, hirer? Technically, as the legislation has it, it's actually the engager. However, that's within the public sector, and the rules haven't come out yet of how this is going to roll into the private sector. There is an onus on top of that, however, that organisations are more broadly required to understand the tax chain and understand the tax liabilities of their supply chain. So our advice on that is that you need to be comfortable with the organisations that you're dealing with in that regard. There are a number of rogue intermediaries out there that we feel the HMRC would have a fairly dim view of, and we're seeing auditing going on in that regard. I think that's probably all we've got time for at this point. But what we will do is, well, there's a number of questions still flowing through, which we'll take away and ask and respond to individually. So I think on behalf of Mike and I would like to thank you for your time today. But if I could just give you a quick ear point to or note point to our webinar series have all been recorded. So they're on hays.co.uk/IR35/webinars. We have a series of roadshows which have already started, and we've got 15 more across the country, which are typically about an hour and a half long sessions, a bit more one-to-one, can answer your questions more specifically. So please jump into our events page on hays.co.uk if you'd like to attend an individual seminar. We also have white papers in terms of lessons learned from the public sector, which forms a lot of our opinion on this. And clearly either drop myself or Mike a note, or we have a separate IR35 email contact address. So thank you for your time today. Have a good afternoon.